Moving on to the next expert panel of the day, we have a set of experts discussing on the topic India's energy transition roadmap, role of green hydrogen and other alternate fuels. I would like to kindly invite the expert panelists on the stage, please. Mr. Ramanuj Kumar, Partner, Project Finance, Infrastructure Projects and Electricity Regulation, Cyril Amarchand Mangaldas. Mr. Bose, Senior Director, ESG, Cyril Amarchand Mangaldas. Mr. Kapil Maheshwari, President, Renewable Energy and Green Hydrogen Development, Reliance Industries Limited. Mr. Raghav Handa, Director, Strategic Business Development, Government Affairs and Sustainability, HSBC India. Ms. Ulka Kelkar, Director, Climate Change, World Resources Institute. The panel intends to discuss the issue that whether the green hydrogen policy announced by the Ministry of Power in the Union Budget for financial year 2023 contains sufficient measures to achieve its ambitious target of achieving 5 million tons per annum green hydrogen production by the year 2030.
Having us, we are delighted to be here and having this conversation. And the topic of the conversation couldn't have been more timely, because just yesterday the Union Cabinet approved the Green Hydrogen Mission, which is a follow-up to the Green Hydrogen Policy which was announced by the MNRE in February 2022. And this announcement also represents a continuum of policy initiatives that the Government of India has taken in the past year and a half to enable and accelerate India's target towards COP27 that it announced, including meeting the challenge of having 50% renewable capacity by 2030, reducing the emissions intensity of GDP by 45%, and meeting other sort of allied targets towards its fight to mitigate climate change. So as part of this initiative, what we intend to discuss today is how green hydrogen can enable and accelerate India's transition to a green economy, how it will enable India's dependence on fossil fuels to be reduced, and how it can help in reducing the emissions from what is called hard to abate sectors, where electrification is not the solution, or reducing dependence on fossil fuels including oil and gas or coal is difficult to achieve, and where green hydrogen can come in and enable achievement of those greening targets, and of course enable a cleaner and a better environment for all of us. We have a stellar panel here. To my left is Bose Verghese. He is our director for ESG practice at Cyril Amarchand Mangaldas. Then there is Kapil Maheshwari. He is spearheading green energy and green hydrogen initiatives at Reliance Industries Limited. Then we have Ms. Ulka Kelkar, very kindly agreed to join us. She is part of World Resources Institute. And we have Raghav Handa from HSBC India, who heads HSBC's Government and Regulatory Affairs and Strategic Business Initiatives. They all represent a variety of views and expertise that is required to pull together this initiative. And I'm going to sort of ask each of them some different sort of kinds of questions and elicit some answers in terms of how where India is placed, and what kind of initiatives or further measures. So the policy announcements, of course, have been made, but the details are yet to be fleshed out. The detailed regulatory framework is yet to be put in place. India is also placed in an international context where other countries are also taking similar initiatives, or probably one can say bolder initiatives in the same space. So for example, if we take the example of United States, just a few months back, US passed what is called Inflation Reduction Act, which promises a financial incentive of roughly $3 per kg for producing green hydrogen. And if that financial incentive is actually implemented, then that would make producing green hydrogen cheaper than what is called grey hydrogen, which is produced from fossil fuel or natural gas. If we take the example of EU has also announced significant policy and financial incentives totaling up to tens of billions of euros, where EU is putting in place a structure where it has said that it will domestically produce 10 million metric tons of hydrogen per annum by 2030, and it's looking to import 10 million tons from other overseas players. This is where sort of India comes in, where Indian players are looking to export at least 70% of the green hydrogen to European and other overseas markets. And then if we take the example of Germany, now Germany is putting in place its own green hydrogen incentive program, which is over and above what EU is proposing. And Germany is also evolving a novel sort of, I would say, market design and a contract structure, where they're following a double auction mechanism, where there is a government intermediary company, government-owned company, which will float global tenders to procure green hydrogen from the open market at a certain price. And then these tenders will be for 10 to 15-year contracts. And then this intermediate company will invite short-term tenders from end users to purchase hydrogen. Now the difference between this company's purchase price and the sale price which they sell to end users, to the extent there is a delta, that will be subsidized or supported by the government to make good the cost incurred by the purchasing company. So it's a very novel model, so to say, in terms of market design and contract design as to how to promote the offtake of green hydrogen as an alternate green fuel. As far as India is concerned, what we have seen in yesterday's green hydrogen mission announcement is there is a almost $2.2 billion or roughly 20,000 crores of financial incentive promised, both to electrolyzer manufacturers and also to the green hydrogen consumers. Now, how that incentive will be utilized, how it will be handed out, what will be the criteria, whether it will be through a, let's say, auction basis or it will be on a grant basis, we are yet to see those details. But what's important is that all of these measures, whether in India, in the United States, in the European Union, all of these measures are ultimately intended to achieve one single objective. That is to bring the cost of green hydrogen down or closer to what we call grey hydrogen, so that the offtake of the green hydrogen takes up by the end consumers in a meaningful way, and usage of fossil fuels or dependence on fossil fuels is significantly reduced. So really, in terms of the challenges, the first challenge that India or sort of any other country is facing today, how to achieve the cost parity, or how to bring the cost of green hydrogen closer to what is called grey hydrogen. And with this context and background, I'll turn to Kapil first to ask Kapil. So Kapil, you're part of the industry, you are in the thick of things. How do you see, in terms of what India has announced is its sort of policy initiatives and what industry is doing? Do you see that that India would be able to, one, have a significant sort of green hydrogen market and an ecosystem in place by the support that the government is promising, and the steps that the industry is taking, and what are the challenges that you see as a sort of as a significant player in the market?
So, am I audible, Ramanuj?
Yes.
Okay, it works. Let me take a step back and see, when we are talking of hydrogen, we already has like 8 to 10% of the global hydrogen market present in India. Although we call it, of course, it is all grey hydrogen, but we are already roughly 5 to 6, possibly more than 6 million metric tons of kind of a market which is already present. Now, why are we all gathering here? It is because of a shift from grey to green. Most of these kind of discussions or conferences weren't happening when refineries and fertilizer companies were using grey hydrogen, none of us were, trying to address such sessions what we are doing now. So from that perspective, I would say India is poised pretty well compared to all the other places in the world, and I'll tell you the reasons why. First, the major aspect of in green hydrogen is lowest cost of renewable power. So, from an LCOE perspective, we are one of the lowest in the world when it comes to the levelized cost of energy through renewable sources. What in addition to that we have benefits is the availability of land. When we talk of some of the other countries which possibly require or are willing to take much of green hydrogen like Japan, they may not have the suitable land available to do very large scale renewable projects to address the needs of renewable power. The second most important aspect is the availability of manpower. We have an ecosystem already developed for renewable power. So, we are fourth largest or third largest renewable energy addition to the world. So, we are doing roughly 10-15 gigawatt of solar every year, 4 to 5 gigawatt of wind which we have already done. So, there is an ecosystem which is in place, which is where we have an added benefit compared to other countries which otherwise now needs to develop that kind of an ecosystem and skilled manpower to do that. From a green hydrogen perspective, I would say it's a level playing field. There is no other nation. So this is for the first time we are getting an opportunity to lead the world rather than just be saying that we would be falling behind or catching the bus, it's already gone, etc., which we have seen in renewable already. So this is where we are. So everybody, all possible geographies globally would be looking at it from perspective of doing some small pilots to proving technologies, and there is a good there is already some bit of which has happened. You have seen large announcements from large Indian conglomerates, Reliance, Adani, Greenko, many of them, and then there are public sector companies who have also announced some very, very good initiatives, be it NTPC, IOCL, etc., on all possible green hydrogen thing. And what we are discussing today is possibly, if you have to compare possibly we got in February in policy, and I would say, what were some of the main points which were there in the policy. The policy calls for an ISTS waiver. So you put up a renewable plant in state A and you can take the power in state B through in CTU, central transmission units. And you are able to get an ISTS waiver, so no transmission charges, etc., would be charged for that. It also calls for a 30-day banking. Now there is no other nation globally which has provided an audacious policy like provision of banking for green hydrogen. Nobody can even think of doing that, where India has actually come up with a policy which actually talks of that. It also talks of many other incentives like creating bunkering at ports, single window clearances. But keeping that in apart, what was missing in the February policy was in demand creation, largely. And we all know that electricity remains a concurrent subject between the central and the state. So it becomes difficult when it comes to implementing policy, what center announces in each of the states, because each state could have its different way of looking at electricity. When we talk of ISTS waiver, banking is not provided by PGCIL. Banking is provided by state discoms. So how would you implement those kind of policy when it comes to state? How much of agreement you can get of all those states? Tomorrow a state can say that I have given land, I have given incentives, renewable energy is generated in my state, and you want to take all the renewable energy and produce green hydrogen in some other state. How that happens, There are states which have already spoken on charging 10% extra on such things if you are taking power from their state to the other state. Such thought process also have been, discussed or debated. So we all need to understand that aspect, that there are practical difficulties also which would come in place when we talk of all these things. And then second was, which was discussed as part of the mission, which is yet to be announced, which we call it as GHCO, which is the green hydrogen compliance obligation. So something like renewable purchase obligation, the government is also trying that these hard to abate sector, what Ramanuj just mentioned, can we impose some part of obligation to them that their hydrogen, some of the portion can be through green hydrogen. That is an initial way of green hydrogen demand creation, with a simple objective that right now the price points are yet not there, and it will be very difficult. In India, you don't have to provide any kind of incentive, subsidy or policy measure if price points are there. We have all seen now, nobody comes and tell that doing in solar on a rooftop is beneficial, because price points are there. Irrespective of any incentive or benefit, I will definitely install it if economies works. So at that point of time, we will not need all that, but at this point of time, that's required. But the mission in present state, what is recently announced, talks of what is called as, it's in total of 19,744 odd crores. It talks of around 17,500 crores, so 17,500 crore for something called a site, which is your strategic intervention for green hydrogen transition. So they also want to see the transition towards this thing, because everybody in globally right now, two important aspects are being looked at. First is their energy transition and energy security. And everyone has seen with the present geopolitical situation with Russia, Ukraine in place, that how important energy security is. Keeping that in mind, India also wants to secure, and because it's taking steps. One thing which is, we have already announced PLI schemes for solar manufacturing, we've already announced it for battery manufacturing. Now at times we address certain places where these things don't work but hydrogen works. So that incentive is what we call a site, is typically for two aspects. First is manufacturing, domestic manufacturing of electrolyzers, and second is green hydrogen manufacturing, so the production of green hydrogen. So that put together, if you compare that any place with the Inflation Reduction Act in US, etc., of course that is lagging behind, because our overall bucket is roughly around 2.3 billion compared to the whole IRA, which is for around 300 odd billion dollars. Of course, it provides incentive across various things, but that's a much larger kind of incentive scheme which is being announced by US. But nevertheless, I would say that still provides a good amount of things, because it, as per the mission, it talks about investments to the tune of 8 lakhs crore. It talks about job creation to the tune of 6 lakh crore. It talks about GHG emission, greenhouse gases emission reduction by 50 million metric tons. And it also talks about, what is more important is to bring in 5 million metric tons of green hydrogen capacity in the country by 2030. Now that is the present capacity what we have. So in 9 years, if we can convert our present capacities to entirely to green, that's again a good step towards in. But and 125 gigawatt of renewable power addition should be done because of this. So that's like pretty significant pie of the overall renewable which can come for that. So keeping all that in mind, I would just say that India at this moment is positioned well, because from an energy security perspective, we are at place, and for the first time possibly we can be an energy exporter. We can be an exporter to green hydrogen for the first time in anything relating to energy globally, because every other nation is also where we are. So this gives an opportunity, definitely gives an opportunity.
So let me ask a follow-up question, Kapil. Thank you for explaining that so nicely. So as a key industry player, and this is not necessarily limited to Reliance, but as an Indian industry exploring the space of green hydrogen and sort of being a key player in this sector, would your business model be focused on domestic demand, or would it be focused on export?
So the business model cannot be alone just on exports or just on domestic thing. It's more market driven. Any business what you set up needs to call for what market demands from it. So take an example, at this moment, India is a net importer of green ammonia.
Correct.
We have an ammonia import bill of around $2.5 billion. Now can I produce green ammonia here? Because green ammonia right now is at around $1,200 to $1,500 a ton. So can I still produce from this green hydrogen, green ammonia, and use it within the country? Because right now I'm paying that kind of in bill. for my domestic consumption as well. At the same time, when we talk of price points for green hydrogen, is it viable to use compared to using grey hydrogen for industries like fertilizer, steel and refineries? Possibly we would look for export to begin with and then look for a more domestic market. With incentives coming in more, I think domestic market also can play a role. And as we move towards more technology advancements, when I say technology advancements, it is all the steps through which we can bring down the gap between grey and green hydrogen and bring the production cost equivalent to grey hydrogen. That will be the price points, I think, at which it will take off for that. And for that, every other industry who is very serious player in green hydrogen would be looking at things like bringing down the cost of renewable power, increasing the efficiency of electrolyzer, increasing the lifetime of electrolyzer, reducing the capex points for electrolyzer, many other technology roadmap which it wants to take up.
Thank you. Thank you so much, madam. Now, Raghav, I'll turn to you. So, clearly this is still an evolving sector. It's a nascent sector, so to say, and requires huge amount of capital to bring in economies of scale and meet any significant portion of, either a 5 MTPA target or any kind of meaningful export commitment. How do you see sort of the India meeting the financing challenges in this sector, and what are the sort of policy priorities that you would think from a banker's perspective that is required to give confidence to both equity and debt investor that this is the right project and that this is the right industry to invest, and that the risk matrix are manageable, so to say?
So I think thanks for this, and thank you for having me here. I think before we step into this, it's just important for us to understand that where do we, that at what level do we, are we currently facing, financing challenges. So India, to meet its NDC targets, right, which is the revised NDC targets, I think of 440 gigawatts by 2030, we roughly need a financing of approximately $173 billion per annum. There are different numbers floating around, but we've done a deep study and it's been submitted to Ministry of Finance and also to the Prime Minister's office. So for the purposes of this discussion, going with this financing, requirement of per annum of about $173 billion, we've also taken an average estimate of the last 3 years credit inflow or maybe credit support to the sector. So from 2019 to 2021, the average credit support to the sector by all banks put together has approximately been at $19.3 billion. So if you see the average credit flow, in 1 year it was 18, then going up to 21, and then probably, coming back again to 18. So, averaging somewhere close to about like $19.3 billion. So if you really see the gap, and, that's where this whole, challenge really stems up, is that we are at about approximately $19 billion of credit support towards renewable as a sector, and and a large part of it has been consumed by traditional power sectors such as solar and onshore wind. Whereas India needs about $173 billion per annum. So this gap of roughly about $152 billion is something that needs to be kind of addressed, right? So this is the main, this is the financing gap, right? Now, how do we move towards it? Our own internal, at HSBC, we've had we have the privilege of co-chairing the Climate Finance Leadership Initiative, the India chapter, and I chair the Mobility Committee. And now, as a part of CFLI and through our own public policy advocacy back to the government, there are two important, policy interventions which we believe will help mobilize, or which will help mobilize, or will rather unlock, the capital that is sitting with the banks. The first one is, how do we try and get a priority sector lending status to to sustainability or to renewables as a sector. Now mind you, as per the current priority sector lending norms, sustainability is recognized as a priority sector, but then there are definite segments. So for example, they kind of recognize solar, they kind of recognize biomass, like wind is spoken about, with an upper threshold of just 30 crores. Now, like 30 crores is not even a chicken feed to a startup, right? You can't, you can't really expect that, with 30 crores you can support a sustainability or maybe maybe an RE project. And the argument that we've had there is that the average credit growth in India, so for example, is at 9%. Now we've kind of supplemented the case that you do not take anything away from politically sensitive or maybe, as in like extremely sensitive sectors for India, which includes MSMEs, SMEs, agriculture, so on and so forth. But purely out of the 9% credit growth that's happening year on year, and that's the average credit growth in India, if we are just able to say take out 5% of, like that and allocate it as a mandatory target, towards, like sustainable financing, say by all banks. And, like, by the way, like GIFT City has done that, right? So like effective April 1st to, 2023, IFSCA, which is the GIFT City regulator, has mandated that all banks operating in GIFT City will be mandated that 5% of their balance sheets need to be allocated, towards sustainable finance. Now the total PSL credit inflow in the market is about $1.4 trillion. So by the argument that I've just given to you, that if we take just 5% of that average credit growth, of that absolute amount of 1.4 trillion, that works out roughly about close to about 70 odd billion dollars. So, the gap that we have, which is at 153 or 152, $70 billion can probably be, taken care of. This sector has been, is probably given the PSL recognition. And, the good part here is that Niti Aayog, and you would have seen the recent, report with RMI Institute, has strongly supported EV as a sector to be given PSL status. So our argument in that same, letter that has been sent further is that if we can just look at expanding the current eligible sectors and segments and expanding the total amount that is eligible under the PSM, under the PSL norms for sustainability as a sector. So that's one. The second intervention that we've proposed is how can, Ministry of Finance help us, in terms of stepping up the participation from multilateral institutions, DFIs, and these multilateral development banks. I must say that they've been very, very actively, supporting the country, and these are right from, the likes of World Bank, IFC, USTFC, and some from UK, a bunch of them from EU as well, which have now expanded into non-sovereign projects as well. So earlier they were only, they only had a mandate for sovereign projects, and now they've expanded to non-sovereign projects as well, which means private sector projects. The argument there is that if they can step up their risk participation, say from 30% or 40% to maybe 80 to 90%, because that's going to help, banks, right, traditional banks rather, to take a call on these new, sunrise sectors. The issue with these new sunrise sectors from a traditional banker's credit lens point of view is that, we often see them as, sectors with huge tech risk. Obviously, there is risk on demand aggregation, there is, which we typically call as off-take risk and so on. But if, just to ensure that the tech risk is taken care of, and we've actually seen quite a number of deals, and HSBC has been involved in quite a few of them. We've just done a deal on supporting a plant for biopellets as well, and that's been done with USTFC, where, our balance sheet funded exposure is 100% securitized by, by a guarantee that comes in from them. Now, this also works in favor of the borrower, irrespective whether the borrower is an SME, MSME, or a large corporate borrower, because if it is PSL lending, it has to come with a margin benefit, and that margin benefit is 100 basis points. And that margin benefit is then passed on to the borrower. And with this co-participation model with these multilateral institutions, it kind of not only kind of allows banks to take, probably an early call on some of these new sectors, but if these projects are long-term or gestated projects, then these multilateral institutions will typically have an appetite, to take long-term exposures. The sweet spot for, commercial banks, I can at least speak for HSBC, is between 5 to 7 years. Now this, works in favor for some borrowers because the cost of interest rate for pre-construction and post-construction is obviously very different. And when we do these semi-perm or mini-perm structures, it kind of allows the borrowers to refinance it after their pre-construction phase is over. And typically most of these renewable and sustainability projects will be pretty much like long-term in nature. So these are two large policy intervention areas, Ramanuj. Specifically on green hydrogen, see, I mean, probably today at an HSBC India, I mean, globally we've got commitments to finance up to $1 trillion. In India, we've already financed green projects, including like socially sustainability linked bonds, green bonds, etc. The on-sheet balance, the onshore, balance sheet exposure is almost about $3.5 billion. The number of bonds that we've issued are close to about $7 billion. So we are not very fussed about the energy mix and the underlying technology. I mean, as long as the project is commercially viable. As far as green hydrogen is concerned, very, very supportive of supporting green hydrogen projects, both in terms of manufacturing of electrolyzers, the component ecosystem that kind of comes with it, including the tech stack, rectifiers, and so on. Blue hydrogen, yes, but then it has to go through an internal clearance process. Brown and grey hydrogen is a strict no. So we are not going to be financing any projects which are brown or grey in, brown and grey in nature. That's as per, in fact, the most recent, release energy policy for HSBC globally. I'll just maybe take a pause there, but yeah, these are the two broad areas.
Yeah, so I just wanted to supplement your point and ask something else. So in fact, the point about PSL lending that you raised, priority sector lending, and the increasing the target and including more sectors within that fold so that there can be a more...
Sorry, so this is not increasing the target. I'm saying within that 40%, so this 5% incremental carve out is actually within the 40% limit, the 40% target that all scheduled commercial banks have to kind of take on for meeting, the prudential norms on PSL.
Right. No, so just the last year, the Parliamentary Standing Committee on Energy had also advocated that, this PSL limit of 30 crores that you mentioned for the renewable energy sector should be, expanded multifold, though they didn't give a number, but that's been obviously a very vocal demand of the banking sector, especially from the MNC banks, that, that should be, one should be made fungible and the more limit should be provided. But I want to ask a more sort of, more related point in terms of the designing the sort of, and improving the bankability of these sort of, new age projects. So you mentioned about essentially, DFI support, which is essentially blended finance. You blend private sector finance with the DFI finance, which comes at a low cost and higher tenor. Could it also be that you look at, for example, something similar to what the government did during the COVID period, which is ECLGS scheme, credit guarantee scheme, where let's say now the government is looking at 20,000 crores of incentives to the sector, obviously to support the sector in its initial stages. Could it also be that either part or the additionality to that let's say the government provides sort of, partial credit guarantee or a sovereign guarantee, let's say up to 20% of the bank funding, so that the banks get more confidence to lend to the sector, to the projects, and they know that at least part of the risk is assumed by the sovereign as well, and that obviously gives confidence to the banking sector and also brings the cost of funds down for the borrower. Could it be that something that the government should look at?
See, I think the government is already looking at it in various shapes and forms, right? So not exactly a credit guarantee scheme, but when you talk about offshore wind, there's been a very serious discussion of introducing viability gap funding, right? So it may not be in form of a guarantee instrument, but there is support that is coming in from the center and the state. Now, that's obviously much needed. See, from a financial standpoint, when you kind of talk about offtake, I'm very comfortable when, SECI is a confirmed offtaker in between, but then the fact is that, and if, SECI has a back-to-back PPA with the state DISCOM, you have an offshore wind at 9 rupees per unit and an onshore wind for about 2.71. The mechanism has to be such that the viability gap funding ensures that there is cost parity for the developer and for the purchaser. Otherwise, offtake will hit a roadblock.
Right.
So to answer your point that yes, it helps. We've also seen a lot of these, some of these schemes being rolled out by the Ministry of Electronics earlier in 2019 and even like before that. So these would obviously help. See, for me, whether it's sovereign risk on India or it is sovereign risk on UK or it is sovereign risk on US, it essentially is the same, right? As long as there is some support I think banks do get that level of confidence on taking calls for some of these new technologies. The other point that I just wanted to highlight is where, and I think we are currently suffering because of that, is that India, like many other countries, doesn't have a standardized taxonomy on sustainable finance,
Yes.
which then, from a borrower standpoint, if a borrower is banking with an X bank, that bank may treat or classify a project as green, whereas in my internal assessment, that project may not be classified as
Yes.
green. Right? When I'm talking about carbon footprint reduction, now how do we strategically partner with clients, right? So for example, I'm talking to a client about helping them to move helping them to shift their global value chains to India. Now, global value chains for that client is a part of Scope 3 universe. Now, at the same time, when I'm engaging with clients on trying to kind of devise a client plan which kind of brings down the carbon emission in the Scope 3 universe, there is a sustainable, financing link program to that.
Right.
But then, and I think, thankfully now, with India being a signatory to clean energy and IPEF, I was speaking to someone very senior in the Department of Energy who's from the chief negotiator team, the technical negotiator to IPEF. And they actually said that one of the main mandates to IPEF is to ensure that all the member countries have a standardized taxonomy. So the moment you have a taxonomy, and I know that RBI is very, very close in kind of rolling it out, there have been various consultations, there have been various risk testing scenarios, probably as well. The moment you have a taxonomy, that itself is also then going to help in terms of, improving the bankability of projects,
Right.
which you just mentioned.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Raghav. Now, if I may change the direction a little bit and turn to Ulka ma'am, to you. Now, when we talk of green hydrogen, renewable energy, sunrise sector, lots of policy initiative, lots of talk about finance, bankability. Relatively, there is less talk of what is the input, what is the resource that goes into making these projects viable and successful. And particularly, I want to talk about, especially for green hydrogen, what is critical is water. So green hydrogen is nothing but sort of, by electrolysis, you break water into oxygen and hydrogen, oxygen is released and you capture green hydrogen. As per various estimates, producing 1 kilogram of green hydrogen requires roughly 10 liters of water. Now, many of our RE-rich states, such as Rajasthan, Gujarat, Karnataka, Tamil Nadu, they are water stressed, or sort of, they are not necessarily abundant in water. Of course, one option is to, wheel the electricity produced in Rajasthan to a state where land and water is abundant, and then sort of, site the green hydrogen manufacturing ecosystem there. But irrespective, and the land requirement also to place large green hydrogen manufacturing systems or green hydrogen hubs, as the government policy calls it, to promote. These require large amounts of land and water. Are you concerned that we as a country and as policymakers are not or maybe paying insufficient attention to the issue of availability of water and availability of land to support these giga projects at a scale which is obviously which is extremely large and which could potentially have, let's say, adverse social consequences?
Thanks, Ramanuj. I think when we talk about climate policy in India, as a developing country, we're always at pains to emphasize the win-win aspects. What is good for climate is also good for air pollution, right? What is good for climate policy is also good for jobs. So there are definitely win-wins, but often, of the kinds of examples that you've talked about, there are also trade-offs.
Yeah.
When there isn't a win-win, there is a trade-off. And there, when you need to make public policy in the presence of such trade-offs, you need dialogue.
Yeah.
I think that's the only solution, and that's the theme of this entire conference. And the public policy dialogue must include all the affected actors or stakeholders. So there's really no shortcut around that very messy, time-consuming, complex process. But you're absolutely right. I think the kinds of points that have been made by Kapil, by Raghav, and indeed the previous session, green hydrogen and electrification is really very critical to India's achievement of its net zero 2070 targets, one of the most important policy levers. In fact, one of the things that we do at WRI India is do systems dynamics modeling. So you don't look at one policy alone, you don't look at one sector alone, but you look at all the feedbacks. A simple feedback is, for example, what we've been saying, that it shouldn't be grey hydrogen, it has to be green hydrogen. Yeah. So you use hydrogen, but you get it from renewables. Where is that electricity going to come from? Who else is going to use that? All of those feedbacks. So our modeling, in fact, shows that this policy, this mission that has been announced yesterday, sets a target of 5 million metric tons by 2030. But to be really impactful for that 2070 net zero target, the real change is going to happen post 2030 as we go towards 2050. Right. And that target will have to be 20 million tons. So in fact, when we start thinking about these land effects, water effects of renewable energy, what we are seeing is only the beginning. Right. It's, if we put in place the right kinds of policies, processes, dialogues now, then when the impacts start really scaling up and really starting to matter, we will have a robust process for selecting the right sites, for choosing whether a particular location should have agriculture continuing, pastoralism continuing, biodiversity being protected, or renewable energy being generated, or in fact plantations being planted, right? So I just wanted to give a couple of points regarding water, for example. I think one of the issues that I think you gave one particular calculation. So for the 5 million metric tons, what we'll need is 50 billion liters of deionized water, right, which will require 150 billion liters of raw water. So that can come from salt seawater, it can come from sewage water, but it will also need to, it will need its own energy in order to be deionized. On land, I think there are estimates of renewable energy that to meet India's solar target, something like 2% of India's land will be required. But if you look at only hydrogen alone, this 5 million metric tons that this mission talks about will require 5 lakh acres of renewable energy to produce that green hydrogen. So not that it can't be done, in fact it needs to be done, but the process by which the sites are chosen will have to be a very thoughtful one. I think the issue of creating these hubs where hydrogen is both produced and consumed locally is something that is part of the logic of hydrogen itself. Yes. Right? It's very expensive to transport it, very complicated to maintain the quality, the purity of hydrogen and all of that. So creating these hubs where you have refineries, where you have fertilizer plants, is really very important and can be done in a way that creates livelihoods for MSMEs, provided that there is equal attention to upskilling and finance. We see a lot of language around that in this mission that was announced yesterday. But it's really something where big companies like Reliance and others can play a very important role in taking along the MSME supply chains, right, for any sector. I'll just end maybe by talking about the international context a little bit. I think the previous session, G20 and India's presidency was mentioned. The kinds of almost threats that we are seeing from like the Europe's carbon border adjustment tax, right, the tariff, is not just one-off, right? That's only one type of financial market-based mechanism that's there are also other kinds of signs that are you could take it as a threat or you can just take it as inevitable. You talked about the US's IRA. One of the things that Biden has introduced is a public procurement policy for construction materials, right, as well. So cement, steel, asphalt and glass must be low carbon steel, low carbon cement. So if we want to compete in the international market, we need to make sure that we meet those standards. And this is where, I mean, your point, Raghav, about the role of the MDBs and lowering the cost of capital. This is something that came up in a very big way at COP27 and at the G20 summit in Bali, and is something that the Indian government can really make a major priority in its presidency over the coming year.
Can I just one point? I think on these MDBs, right, there was a recent initiative by the Department of Economic Affairs led by the DEA Secretary Ajay Seth himself, just very recently, where there's been a very concerted push and an effort to bring down the credit assessment time frame that an MDB takes today, which on average is 12 to 15 months, right? Now, if a borrower has to wait for 12 to 15 months, and if a commercial bank has to wait for blended finance for 12 to 15 months, I think the project will just die its own death. The second element that they're really pushing up is a higher level of participation by these MDBs and MLIs, which as of now is limited to just a couple of $1 billion. And, that too, you can probably just count them. Rest are maybe just hundreds of millions of dollars. They've not even touched $1 billion of total exposure in the country as of now. So one is a stepped up, the second is a stepped up exposure there. And the third is a higher level of risk security. Just one point which actually didn't cross my mind, which I thought it's important to mention from a financing and a bankability standpoint, is that the source of the project essentially has to be green. So you can't have an coal-fired plant producing an EV battery and then kind of consider it as a green project for bank to then consider it, right? So the source has to be green, and I think there's one project which is being worked near the Rameshwaram, belt by two very large UK companies, and we are aware of that. Is that they are trying to, with this whole offshore wind piece,
yes,
they are trying to install electrolyzers for, for production of the offshore wind. So the source is green.
Okay.
And then obviously the transportation is obviously, of no problem, right? So so the point really being that we recently got cases again of, say, providing financing support to charging infrastructures. Now the point is that the power that is relayed by the grid to the charging infrastructure, when that source is not green, then how is that power green?
Yeah.
Right? So the important point is that going forward, I think it's going to be very, very crucial for banks who are going to be, probably amplifying their presence in supporting sustainably, these sustainable projects, that the source of power essentially has to be green and, not only the end output or maybe the final product.
Essentially, you're looking at life cycle green value chain from the start to the final product.
So you can't have it now, but
yes, right. Thank you for that. Bose, now coming to you. You're an ESG expert. Now, how does this, or rather, let me reframe it. Does this whole sort of promotion or rather sort of deepening of, let's say, green energy and green hydrogen in particular, how does it tie into the ESG agenda of large corporates? Do you believe that the ESG commitments, or rather the ESG disclosures and targets and ESG framework, do they provide an impetus to the large corporates to move to the sort of procurement or larger offtake of green hydrogen, of course, as and when it becomes available, in addition, and not necessarily limiting to the sort of offtake of green energy or solar and wind energy? Do they sort of complement each other?
Yeah, am I audible? Is this on? Yeah, the simple answer is yes, obviously, but more so from corporates who have hard to abate, sectors under them. They are actually looking forward to this sector to take off and actually banging on this sector, green hydrogen to come along. Okay. We heard that, green steel and green cement,
right.
All that's going to be becoming more and more in demand. The global carbon tax regime, which is probably 1 or 2 years away from us.
Yes.
That's going to drive this whole, commodities based on carbon intensity and taxation based on carbon intensity.
Right.
So these corporates will be forced to, one way or the other, look at ways to reduce their carbon intensity. Right. And for the hard to abate sectors, I think hydrogen is the best bet available today. Where they have to use fuel directly, in steel, for example. Pure RE is not going to help them much. So definitely yes. And for other corporates, they will wait for, like today, general corporates, how they support the EV ecosystem. They are looking at, my company, when I came from Infosys, they use a lot of cabs for business and employee transportation. They are looking at the earliest opportunities to plug in the EV, players into that ecosystem. So, I mean, that helps in their own, scope 3 reduction. And a lot of these corporations have these commitments already. And they are actually looking at ways to really, tackle that. And they are looking at all options.
So
and
what you are saying,
will play into that.
So what you are saying is that, and Kapil spoke about mandates, and I know that the government amended the Energy Conservation Act just last month to introduce the power to impose what Kapil mentioned, the GNCO or the green hydrogen purchase obligations, where the government can mandate certain specified industries which are large emitters to purchase a certain portion of their energy requirement through green hydrogen. Now, what you are saying also, Bose, is that in addition to the mandates or the imposed obligations, there is also a market, or there is also a demand quarter where there is a self-sustainable drive to meet the ESG targets. Mandates need not be necessary, but there would still be a market for green hydrogen.
Absolutely. But it may not, that demand, the market-driven demand, you may not be able to time it so perfectly.
Okay.
I mean, this mechanism will give you demand clarity, right? If you put green hydrogen purchase obligation,
right,
then you have a fair idea of what kind of demand that's going to create in the market. And that can really work in giving visibility for investors and things like that.
Just a related question, since you spoke about carbon border adjustment tax that is being contemplated by EU, and many of our metallurgy sector, for example, or even other industrial sectors, they have large export markets. Is a carbon tax or a carbon trading mechanism, which is also again sought to be introduced through the amendment to the Energy Conservation Act, is that a necessity, both to stimulate demand for alternative energies like green hydrogen, and also to meet the challenge of your export markets where carbon border adjustment tax would be a reality maybe in a couple of years? And do you see that is the Indian industry and Indian market ready to face a carbon tax?
Well, I mean, the whole carbon price, whether it's a tax or,
cap and trade.
Cap and trade, any of this is a tool that various governments look at different ways or modes of really driving the low carbon transition, and they find the best useful tool. And especially the EU, just yesterday the UK reported the highest renewables content in their grid, 80% RE.
Yes.
They were running yesterday in the UK grid. So they are at that level. So obviously they have very low intensity from the products coming out of there. So
not necessarily the case with Germany, which is refiring coal plants.
Yeah, I mean that's hopefully a temporary slippage.
Right.
But they see it as an advantage. They see it as a tool to drive global transition. So people, the whole climate space anyway is a big geopolitical, arena as well, right? A lot of.
So interesting that you mentioned geopolitical. So do you see this as and I think Ulka ma'am also touched upon it. Is it some kind of a new form of trade barrier, non-tariff barrier, so to say, or some form of climate imperialism by the West?
I mean,
provocative question.
That is definitely, that's, it could be argued both ways, right? I mean, so just last month, I read about the Biden government actually considering using carbon tax for steel and aluminum, specifically targeting China.
Okay.
And then they got EU to sort of collaborate with them. So it hasn't taken any shape as a formal proposal, but this is a consideration. I mean, they're talking about it. So
It's a legitimate trade policy tool.
It has two edges for sure, right?
Right.
I mean,
Right.
so I'm going to leave it at that.
Kapil, I'll end the session with last question to you. Obviously, as you said, that the domestic demand and as well as the export, both will form key consideration for, while making a business case or, putting up for FID decisions for setting up green hydrogen project. Now, what specific challenges do you see in terms of meeting the export commitment, especially when there is a, what you say, regulatory disconsonance in terms of, let's say, and Raghav also mentioned about it in terms of taxonomy, for example, that India is yet to evolve a uniform set of standards or rules in terms of what would constitute green hydrogen. Would you ship it in fossil fuel powered, let's say, vessels to EU, for example? Would it continue to remain a green, for example? Or EU says that they will do quarterly matching of the renewable energy generation plus the output into the green hydrogen, which will then move to an hourly matching. Now, obviously, these are significant sort of gap in standards. Now, do you see a case that sort of India should be taking proactive steps to harmonize regulations with the target export markets, where our product can go export without facing these regulatory barriers? And do you see this as a significant challenge?
I would say that these are significant barriers, but we should definitely try to align our policy at this moment so that we can, produce hydrogen in India, for India and for the world.
Right.
From that perspective. But at the same time, why should India only align its policy to the usage of EU if EU doesn't want to align its policies to the fact that they are saying you have to produce renewable energy at the same time when you are using green hydrogen? We have an open dialogue with them and make them understand that what you are trying to do could hamper the progress of the overall thing.
Now you're talking like Dr. S. Jaishankar.
I mean, I wish I can, first. And second, I really like when he said that, when on our imports of gas from Russia.
Yes.
I wish I can do something. I can be of...
No, but you're being very candid, and that's an important point.
So, we can always discuss with them, where else EU can get 10 million metric tons from. They also have to understand and appreciate the fact that without India being a partner country for the import portion what they have kept for green hydrogen, it will be very difficult for them also to get it from Saudi or Oman or any other place. India has to be taking a pie of that, and it's good that we align our policies in the beginning so that we will be able to export easily, and they will also be able to take it from us, and there is no mismatch. But nevertheless, EU is not the only market which would be for export perspective. We could also evaluate Japan, Australia, many other nations which could be looking at India for that perspective. As I said, India has some inherent benefits. Even from an availability of water, I would say, we talked about like 150 billion India, the coastal belt what we have could certainly help us in that aspect also. Of course, we are not as prominent desalination country as some of the Middle East countries, but nevertheless that can be developed as a skill set, because even in Middle East, companies who are doing this stuff is all Indian companies, where they have their own company to do that. And manpower which is there to do all that is all in from India.
But that would add to the per kilogram or per ton cost of the hydrogen, right?
Definitely. We certainly need fresh water, DI water, but that's part of it. We will definitely improve the diesel plants efficiencies as well, to see how do we make use of that water as well. But that, I'm just saying from a perspective that India possibly has good amount of elements present. It does see a 300 days sunshine, unlike EU. It does see, and financing also is not a bigger challenge now for India. So land is there, financing is there, manpower is there, and technology is there. So what else you need as a mix? And other nations needs to probably appreciate this fact.
Great.
If I could just add one sentence to that, is what we need is regulatory uncertainty.
Yes.
I mean, what the certainty, what the EU ETS and the CBAM does is it gives you the plan of action for the next
Correct.
few years. Here we shouldn't have things like rolling back PPAs or changing from net metering to gross metering. If we can give certainty to industry, then we can make use of these opportunities.
That would certainly be the ask of Raghav as a banker. Regulatory certainty, right. So great. So then I think on that note, I would like to end the session. I really thank all the panelists, Bose, Kapil, Ulka ma'am and Raghav. Thank you very much for taking time and effort to come here. Thank you ISB, all the organizers for having us here, and I hope you enjoyed the session. And if you have any follow-up questions from the audience or your other members, we would be happy to sort of answer offline. Thank you very much.